In a quiet, affluent neighborhood, the arrival of a new neighbor didn't go unnoticed. This was a place known for its tranquility and pristine homes, with manicured lawns and quiet, tree-lined streets. The kind of place where everyone knew each other, and nothing ever seemed out of place. At 45, Thomas Harris, the head of a federal investigation team, had finally found the home he dreamed of, a place to call his own after years of grueling work. Thomas was a tall man with sharp features and a calm, collected demeanor. His reputation as a successful and methodical investigator had earned him respect in his field. He had worked tirelessly to get to this point in his life, and now he was ready for some peace. His new house was located at the end of a cul-de-sac near a small park. It was everything he'd imagined, a quiet corner to retreat to after the long days he'd spent solving complex cases. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the pale yellow sunlight filtered through the trees, Thomas sat on a bench in his front yard, sipping coffee. He admired the neat, tidy garden he had already begun to cultivate. This was his escape, a peaceful place where he could unwind. Yet, he had no idea that this calm was about to be shattered. The quiet was broken by the low hum of an engine. A white and navy blue police car pulled up to the house next door, and a middle-aged man stepped out, dressed in full uniform. Thomas glanced up and gave him a polite nod. The man, clearly not expecting a friendly greeting, paused for a moment before walking towards Thomas's garden. His blue eyes narrowed, and his expression was one of mild suspicion. "What's your business here?" the man asked, his voice gruff and confrontational. Taken aback, Thomas stood up slowly, trying to remain calm. "Hello, I just moved in. This is my new home." The officer raised an eyebrow, his eyes scanning Thomas's face. "You bought this house?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, I moved in yesterday. I'm Thomas Harris." He extended his hand, but the officer only looked at it coldly before crossing his arms. "I've been here for 8 years, the officer said, his tone dismissive. "This neighborhood's pretty quiet. Not sure it's the right fit for someone like you." Thomas felt the sting of the unspoken words but kept his composure. He had dealt with much worse in his career and knew how to keep a cool head. "I think I have every right to live here," he replied evenly. "I'm following the rules, as everyone should." The officer's frown deepened, his suspicion growing. "Maybe this area has certain expectations. You might be more comfortable somewhere else." Thomas stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "I'm here to live, not to ask for permission. If that's all you've got to say, then I'd appreciate it if we end the conversation here." The officer's lips tightened, and a tense silence lingered in the air. Finally, he gave Thomas a tight, humorless smile. "Just a warning," he said, his voice lowering. "We don't want trouble here." As the officer turned and walked back to his car, Thomas stood there, watching him with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. It was clear to him that the man had prejudged him. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Back in his living room later that evening, Thomas couldn't help but replay the encounter. He had faced dangerous criminals and high-stakes situations in his career, but this was different. This was in his home, in a neighborhood he had hoped would be peaceful. Thomas sat at his desk and glanced at the security footage from the cameras he had installed around the house, a precaution he always took with his line of work. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he muttered to himself, the sarcasm heavy in his voice. He knew that this would be more than just a quiet place to retire after work. He had a feeling his patience would soon be tested. The next morning, Thomas Harris started his day early. He had always been someone who thrived on routine, and today was no different. After a brisk jog through the quiet neighborhood, the cool, crisp air helped clear his mind. The birds were chirping in the trees, and the sun's first light painted the sky with shades of orange and gold. The peaceful surroundings were just what he needed, especially after yesterday's unsettling encounter. After returning home, he prepared a light breakfast and settled into his favorite chair with a book. The life of a federal investigator was anything but relaxing, but in these quiet moments, he could pretend that the pressures of his career were far away. As he flipped through the pages, the world outside seemed distant, until he heard the familiar hum of an engine again. He looked up from his book and saw the same police car from the day before slowly pulling up to the curb. This time, however, there was no polite nod or casual glance. The officer from yesterday, now in plain clothes, stepped out of the vehicle with the same determined look. His name was Roy Turner, and there was no mistaking the hostility that radiated from him. "Thomas Harris, right?" Roy called out from the sidewalk, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Thomas closed the book and looked up, his expression neutral but wary. "Yes, we met yesterday," he replied, his voice calm but guarded. Roy walked up to the low fence separating their properties, his arms crossed in front of him. "We need to talk," he said, not waiting for an invitation. Thomas stood, deciding it was better to face this head-on rather than ignore it. He walked over to the fence, keeping a respectful distance but making it clear he wouldn't be intimidated. "I don't know what your issue is with me, Officer Turner," Thomas began, "but I bought this house with my own money. I'm not asking for anyone's permission to live here. I follow the rules, just like everyone else." Roy's lips tightened. "This neighborhood isn't like the others. It has certain standards, and frankly, I don't think it's the right place for someone like you." Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly, the edge in Roy's words unmistakable. He had dealt with these kinds of comments in his line of work before, but hearing it in his own front yard from a member of the local police made it feel different. "I don't need advice from you on where I should live," Thomas replied evenly, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm here to stay, and I suggest you leave this conversation alone." Roy's face reddened with frustration. "I'm just trying to help you, Harris," he said, his voice growing more aggressive. "I'm looking out for you. You're not welcome here." Thomas stepped closer to the fence, his posture straight and unyielding. "No, Roy, what you're doing is trying to intimidate me, and that's not going to work." Roy's nostrils flared, and he clenched his fists at his sides. "You'll regret this," he muttered, glaring at Thomas with a simmering hatred. "We don't want your kind causing trouble around here." Thomas stood his ground, unfazed. "What exactly is it you think I'm going to cause trouble? I'm just a man who wants to live in peace, but I'm not afraid of your threats." Roy turned on his heel and walked back to his car without another word, but his posture and the way he threw a final glance over his shoulder said it all. He wasn't finished yet. That night, as Thomas sat in his living room, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. He had faced plenty of adversaries in his line of work, but this wasn't about solving a case. This was personal, and it wasn't going to end with just a few rude comments. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Thomas said quietly to himself, the sarcasm thick in his voice. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he knew it wouldn't be a smooth ride. The next morning, as he prepared for another day of work, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant back at the office, another case that needed his attention. But as he got ready, his mind kept drifting back to Roy Turner and the hostility that lingered in the air. There was something deeply unsettling about the officer's behavior, and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an isolated incident. Something bigger was at play. Later that day, as he was preparing for another meeting, Thomas glanced out the window and saw Roy Turner again, this time in uniform. He was walking across the street, heading towards Thomas's house. The tension in the air was palpable, and this time, Thomas didn't plan on letting things escalate. He had seen enough of this kind of behavior to know it wasn't going to stop unless he stood up to it. With a deep breath, Thomas stood, preparing for whatever came next. The next day, the sky was overcast, casting a gray blanket over the quiet neighborhood. Thomas Harris, still adjusting to his new home, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling after his last encounter with Roy Turner. He had hoped for peace, but Roy had made it clear that he had other plans. As Thomas was finishing his morning coffee, the rumble of a police cruiser broke the stillness. He didn't need to look out the window to know it was Roy. The man had a habit of driving slowly through the neighborhood, and today, he was clearly here to pick up where their last conversation had left off. When Thomas stepped outside, he saw Roy standing near the gate, the officer's posture rigid, his eyes narrowed. There was no pretense of civility this time. "Thomas," Roy said, his voice sharp, "we need to talk." "I think we've talked enough already, Roy," Thomas replied, his tone even. He wasn't going to engage in another round of insults. If Roy had something new to say, let him say it. Roy stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Thomas. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This is a quiet neighborhood. People like you don't fit in." Thomas felt the sting of the words but stood firm. "I belong wherever I choose to live, and I followed all the rules. This is my home now." Roy's eyes darkened. "No, it's not. People around here expect peace. They don't want someone like you moving in." Thomas took a deep breath. He had dealt with this kind of hostility before, but hearing it from a police officer, someone sworn to protect, made it sting all the more. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm here to stay." Roy's expression twisted with anger. He took a step forward, his fist clenching. "You think you can just walk into my neighborhood and do whatever you want? I'm not in anyone's neighborhood, Roy. I'm in my home," Thomas responded, his voice calm but sharp. Before Thomas could say more, Roy's hand went to his sidearm. The motion was quick, almost too fast for Thomas to react, but he stayed rooted in place, his eyes never leaving Roy's. "Put the gun down, Roy," Thomas said, his voice steady. "This is a huge mistake." Roy's gaze flickered, the gun still trained on Thomas. "You're crossing the line now." "I'm not the one with the gun in my hand," Thomas said coolly. "Put it away, and let's talk." Roy didn't lower the weapon. Instead, his grip tightened, and Thomas knew this wasn't a simple spat between neighbors anymore. But just as the tension was about to escalate, Thomas pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing quickly. "Rick," he said into the phone, "I need you to come here right now. There's a problem." Within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of a squad car lit up the street. Police Chief Rick Daniels stepped out of the car, his eyes immediately going to Roy, whose gun was still aimed at Thomas. "Roy," Rick said, his voice cold with authority, "what the hell is going on here?" Roy stammered, trying to explain, but Rick didn't let him. "This man is not a threat. He lives here. He owns this property." Roy's face turned pale as he realized his mistake. I didn't know." "Then you should have known," Rick interrupted. He turned to Thomas. "I'm sorry for this, Thomas. We'll handle it." Rick motioned for another officer to disarm Roy, and within moments, Roy was standing there, his gun now in someone else's hands. Rick turned back to him with a look of disgust. "You're suspended, Roy. Immediately." As Roy's shoulders slumped, Thomas looked at Rick, his tone calm but unwavering. "I don't want revenge, Rick, but this can't be ignored. People like Roy can't be allowed to abuse their power." Rick nodded solemnly. "You have my word, Thomas. We'll deal with this." Roy didn't speak another word as he was led away, his career now hanging by a thread. Thomas watched him go, his mind already shifting toward the next steps. The fight for justice had only just begun, but for the first time in days, he felt a small sense of relief. The days following the confrontation with Officer Roy Turner were a blur of emotions and events for Thomas. His once peaceful neighborhood had been disrupted, and the ripple effects of that one evening spread far beyond his front door. It wasn't just about the incident with Roy anymore, it was about a much larger issue, racism and prejudice that ran deep in places people rarely saw, like law enforcement and suburban communities. The media quickly latched onto the story, and soon, news vans parked outside Thomas's home. Reporters and journalists hounded him for interviews, but Thomas remained silent, his resolve unwavering. He knew this wasn't about a personal vendetta or a quick headline. This was about something deeper, an opportunity to bring change to a system that had too long been allowed to perpetuate inequality. Around noon, his phone buzzed with messages. Some were from colleagues at the FBI, others from old friends, and a few from civil rights groups that wanted to offer their support. But one call stood out. It was Rick Daniels, the police chief. "Thomas," Rick's voice was full of sincerity, "I want to personally apologize again. I can't believe what happened with Roy. This isn't how we operate. I want you to know we're investigating this thoroughly, but more importantly, I want you to know that I'm committed to making sure this kind of thing never happens again." Thomas leaned against the kitchen counter, his gaze focused but distant. "I appreciate the apology, Rick, but this isn't just about one officer. This is about a much bigger issue, the culture within the department, the way people with power misuse it. Roy isn't the only one, and you know that." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Rick replied, his voice resolute. "You're absolutely right, and we're already working on making changes. Roy's under investigation, and I'm taking full responsibility for what happened." "That's a start," Thomas said, "but we need to address the deeper problems. This isn't just about punishment, it's about reform." As the day passed, Thomas's thoughts turned toward the larger picture. The incident with Roy Turner was a symptom of a much more pervasive issue, a system that allowed for abuse of power, unchecked prejudice, and a lack of accountability. It wasn't just about what Roy had done to him, it was about the thousands of other cases that went unnoticed, unpunished, and ignored. That afternoon, there was a knock on his door. Thomas opened it to find Mrs. Jane, the neighbor who had kept her distance ever since he moved in. She held a homemade apple pie in her hands, her eyes filled with regret. "Thomas," she began, her voice faltering, "I owe you an apology. When you first moved in, I admit I had my doubts. I didn't know what to think. But after everything that's happened, I see now how wrong I was. I should have said something when Roy threatened you. I should have done more." Thomas accepted the pie with a quiet smile, touched by her gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Jane. Your words mean a lot to me." She looked at him, clearly sincere. "I want you to know that you're not alone here. I'm going to talk to the other neighbors. We need to stand together against prejudice, against hatred. You're one of us." Her words, though simple, held weight. Change, he realized, could start in small ways, one person speaking out, one neighbor at a time. Over the next several days, Thomas began to notice a shift in the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once avoided him now greeted him warmly, some even stopping by to offer small gifts, apologizing for not standing up when they saw what happened. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The walls of suspicion and discomfort were beginning to come down. The media coverage continued, and pressure mounted on the local police department. Rick kept his promise. Within a week, Roy Turner was officially dismissed from the force, and the district attorney's office was conducting a full investigation into his actions. While Thomas appreciated the action taken, he knew this wasn't enough. It was just the first step. He continued to push for broader change. "Punishment is not enough," he said in interviews. "What we need is systemic reform. We need to address biases in the police force, in the community. This isn't just about one officer, it's about changing a culture." His words resonated with many, and the momentum for reform began to build. But Thomas knew this wasn't a battle that could be won in a single day or even a single year. This was a long-term fight. That evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, Thomas sat on his porch, reflecting on everything that had transpired. He had faced adversity, but he had also seen a glimmer of hope. A neighborhood that had once been cold and distant was starting to show signs of warmth and solidarity. It wasn't perfect, and it would never be overnight, but it was a start. The trial of Officer Roy Turner had been swift. The security footage, the testimonies, and the public outcry were enough to ensure that justice would be served. On the day of the verdict, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the seats, along with local community members who had followed the case closely. Even though Thomas had never wanted fame, he knew that this trial was about more than just his personal experience. It was about sending a message to the entire country. Roy had pled guilty to armed intimidation, misconduct, and racial discrimination. The judge sentenced him to 6 years in prison, a harsh sentence meant to reflect the gravity of his actions. When the verdict was read, Roy bowed his head in shame, his face pale and drawn. It wasn't just the end of his career, it was the end of his life as he knew it. For Thomas, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase the pain of the past weeks. Still, he held his head high, knowing that his fight wasn't just for himself but for a better future for those who would come after him. Back in the neighborhood, change continued to ripple outward. The once distant neighbors who had been wary of Thomas now welcomed him with open arms. It wasn't just small gestures, they were talking about real change, about how to make their community a place where everyone could feel safe and accepted, regardless of their background. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One evening, just as the sun began to set, Thomas stood on his front porch, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. People were walking their dogs, children played on the sidewalks, and cars drove by at a steady pace. It felt like a different place, a place where he belonged, a place that was no longer defined by fear or division. As he turned to head inside, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Rick Daniels, the police chief, walking up the driveway. Rick was holding a file in his hand, a serious look on his face. "Thomas," Rick said as he approached, his voice steady, "I wanted to thank you. Not just for staying calm during everything with Roy, but for making me see things differently. You've given me a wake-up call about how much work we have to do, and I'm committed to making real change." Thomas smiled faintly, appreciating the sincerity in Rick's words. "I'm glad to hear that, Rick. I know it's not easy, but we all have a part to play in making this a better place." Rick nodded, then handed him the file. "I've taken steps to ensure that no one like Roy ever wears a badge in this department again. We're starting retraining programs for officers, addressing biases, and holding everyone accountable." Thomas accepted the file, glancing at it briefly. "It's a start, but we have a long way to go. We need to keep pushing for systemic change. This can't be just a one-time fix." "I know," Rick replied, his voice firm, "and we will. But change starts with people like you, people who aren't afraid to speak up." As Rick turned to leave, Thomas watched him walk down the driveway, his heart heavy but hopeful. This was only the beginning of a long road toward true equality, but it was a road he was ready to walk. And for the first time in a long while, he believed that change was possible. That night, as he sat at his kitchen table, Thomas received a call from an old colleague at the FBI. The conversation was brief but important. There were still cases to solve, investigations to lead, and people to protect. But now, more than ever, he understood the weight of his work. His fight for justice hadn't ended with Roy Turner's conviction, it had only just begun. With a quiet resolve, Thomas placed the phone down and stared out the window. The stars twinkled above, and he thought about the future, the long, challenging, but hopeful future that lay ahead. The neighborhood had changed, yes, but the world, he knew, had a lot more to change too. And Thomas Harris, with all his strength, would be there, leading the way.